Imagine standing in the pitch-black desert of Saudi Arabia at 2 in the morning on January 17, 1991. The air is cold, dropping to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, but the ground is literally vibrating beneath your boots. Above you, invisible in the moonless sky, the greatest concentration of aerial firepower since the Second World War is hurtling toward the Iraqi border. We are talking about an armada of over 300 American fighter jets, bombers, and electronic warfare aircraft, all synchronized to strike a sovereign nation's air defenses in a single, overwhelming wave. This is not a gradual escalation. This is a synchronized, hyper-violent decapitation strike designed to blind, deafen, and paralyze the fourth largest military on the planet in a matter of hours. Welcome back to the War Room, where we dissect the tactics, the logistics, and the raw firepower that shape modern combat. If you want to understand how wars are actually won before the infantry even crosses the line of departure, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments which air campaign you think changed history the most. Now, let us strip away the mythology and look at the cold, hard mechanics of the Gulf War air supremacy blitz. To understand the sheer ferocity of Operation Desert Storm, you have to look backward, not to August of 1990, when Saddam Hussein rolled into Kuwait, but to the jungles of Vietnam and the plains of Western Europe. The American military establishment of the 1970s was a battered institution, suffering from a severe hangover after a decade of grinding asymmetric warfare in Southeast Asia. Operation Rolling Thunder, the bombing campaign over North Vietnam, had been a masterclass in how not to fight an air war. It was a strategy of gradual escalation, micromanaged by politicians picking targets over breakfast in Washington, allowing the North Vietnamese ample time to build the most dense anti-aircraft artillery network in the world. The lesson the Air Force took away from Vietnam was written in the blood of downed Phantom and Thud pilots. Never again would American air power be doled out in piecemeal, predictable packets. The new doctrine demanded overwhelming, simultaneous, and unrelenting force from the very first second of hostilities. At the same time, the strategic focus shifted violently back to the Cold War chessboard, specifically the Fulda Gap in Germany. American military planners were staring down the barrel of the Soviet Red Army, an absolute juggernaut that boasted tens of thousands of T-72 and T-80 main battle tanks, backed by a staggering umbrella of mobile surface-to-air missiles. To survive a Soviet armored thrust into Western Europe, the United States realized they could not win a war of attrition. They had to win a war of technology. They invested billions into a concept called air-land battle, a doctrine designed to disrupt and destroy enemy second-echelon forces before they could even reach the front lines. This meant developing aircraft that could see further, shoot faster, and evade radar entirely. The 1970s and 80s saw the birth of the F-15 Eagle, the F-16 Fighting Falcon, the A-10 Thunderbolt II, and the highly classified F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighter. These were not just new planes, they were nodes in a massive integrated kill web. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, a different kind of military machine was being forged in the Middle East. Saddam Hussein had spent the 1980s locked in a brutal trench warfare slugfest with Iran. The Iran-Iraq War was a meat grinder that looked more like the Battle of the Somme in 1916 than a modern conflict, complete with human wave attacks and chemical weapons. But while the infantry suffered, the Iraqi military grew massive. By 1990, Iraq fielded an army of over 1 million men, organized into 60 divisions. They possessed over 5,000 main battle tanks, 3,000 artillery pieces, and an air defense network that was, on paper, one of the most formidable outside the Warsaw Pact. But wars cost money, and Saddam was functionally bankrupt, owing tens of billions of dollars to his Arab neighbors, particularly Kuwait. On August 2, 1990, Saddam solved his debt problem by invading his creditor. Iraqi Republican Guard armored divisions, spearheaded by T-72 tanks, crushed the Kuwaiti defenses in a matter of hours, positioning Iraqi forces right on the border of Saudi Arabia. The geopolitical stakes were existential. If Saddam Hussein decided to keep rolling his tanks south into the Saudi oil fields, he would effectively control a massive percentage of the global energy supply. The United States simply could not allow a hostile dictator to hold the global economy hostage. But how do you project enough combat power halfway across the world to stop a million-man army? The answer was a logistical miracle known as Operation Desert Shield. Before a single bomb was dropped, the United States military had to move an iron mountain of supplies from North America and Europe to the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula. We are talking about a logistical pipeline stretching over 7,000 miles. Cargo ships, roll-on, roll-off vessels, and a continuous bridge of C-5 Galaxy and C-141 Starlifter transport planes began pouring troops, tanks, and aviation fuel into Saudi air bases. Just consider the fuel requirements alone. A single F-15 Eagle flying a combat air patrol burns through roughly 2,000 gallons of jet fuel an hour. Now multiply that by hundreds of aircraft flying around the clock. The United States Air Force had to construct massive temporary fuel farms in the desert, laying miles of pipeline and positioning hundreds of thousands of munitions in hardened bunkers. It was a triumph of supply chain management that makes our modern civilian shipping networks look like a corner lemonade stand. But while the ground forces were building up for a potential defensive battle, a small group of Air Force planners in the basement of the Pentagon were drawing up an offensive masterpiece. Led by Colonel John Warden, the Checkmate Planning Group devised a strategy called Instant Thunder. The name itself was a direct middle-finger rebuke to the failed Rolling Thunder campaign of Vietnam. Warden viewed the Iraqi state as a system of 5 concentric rings. The innermost ring was the leadership, Saddam, and his command and control apparatus. The next ring was key production and infrastructure, electricity, oil, and communications. The third was the transportation network. The fourth was the civilian population, which they aimed to isolate from the regime's propaganda rather than bomb. And the outermost, least important ring in Warden's mind was the fielded military forces. Warden's philosophy was simple. Why fight 1 million men in the sand when you can cut off the head of the snake and watch the body die? This plan was eventually handed over to Lieutenant General Chuck Horner, the Joint Force Air Component Commander in theater, who refined it into a massive 4-phased air campaign. Phase 1 was the critical step, the absolute destruction of Iraq's strategic air defenses and command and control network. You cannot systematically dismantle a nation's infrastructure if your bombers are getting swatted out of the sky by surface-to-air missiles. Air supremacy was not just a goal, it was the prerequisite for survival. So, let us rack and stack the combatants. On the defensive side, you have the Iraqi Air Force and the Iraqi Air Defense Command. Do not make the mistake of thinking this was a bunch of guys in the desert with rusty rifles. The Iraqi Air Defense Network, codenamed KARI, which is Iraq spelled backwards in French, was a state-of-the-art computerized command and control system built by French contractors. It integrated over 400 early warning radars, tying them into 4 regional sector operations centers, which then fed information to intercept operations centers. This system controlled a terrifying array of Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles. We are talking about roughly 160 SA-2 Guideline and SA-3 Goa batteries for high-altitude defense, and over 100 SA-6 gainful mobile systems to protect their armored columns. Down in the weeds, the airspace was defended by over 7,000 anti-aircraft artillery pieces, including the lethal ZSU-23-4 Shilka, a radar-guided, 4-barreled 23mm meat chopper that could shred a low-flying jet in a heartbeat. Add to this thousands of shoulder-fired infrared missiles, and the airspace over Baghdad was mathematically more heavily defended than Eastern Europe during the height of the Cold War. In the air, the Iraqi Air Force boasted over 700 combat aircraft. Their elite squadrons flew the Soviet MiG-29 Fulcrum, a highly maneuverable 4th-generation fighter armed with the R-73 Archer missile, a weapon that could be fired off-bore sight using a helmet-mounted sight. They also operated the MiG-25 Foxbat, a massive twin-engine interceptor capable of hitting Mach 2.8, designed specifically to hunt high-altitude bombers. They had French Mirage F-1s equipped with Exocet anti-ship missiles, and hundreds of older MiG-21s and MiG-23s. These aircraft were housed in heavily reinforced concrete bunkers designed to withstand a direct hit from a 1,000-pound bomb. The Iraqi pilots were combat veterans, having spent 8 years flying strike missions against Iran. They were fighting over their own territory, supported by a massive ground control intercept network. Now look at the American and coalition armada. The technological disparity was about to become horrifyingly apparent. The spearhead of the American air-to-air capability was the McDonnell Douglas F-15C Eagle. This was an air superiority fighter with a perfect, undefeated combat record. Powered by 2 Pratt & Whitney F-100 turbofan engines, the Eagle could accelerate straight up. Its primary weapon was the AIM-7 Sparrow, a radar-guided missile, and the AIM-9 Sidewinder for close-in dogfights. But the real killer was the APG-70 radar in its nose, capable of tracking multiple targets at ranges exceeding 100 miles, long before the Iraqi pilots even knew they were being painted. For ground attack, the coalition brought the F-16 Fighting Falcon, the F-15E Strike Eagle, and the venerable A-10 Thunderbolt II, a flying titanium bathtub built around a 30mm GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon. But the true ace in the hole, the aircraft that would change the geometry of warfare forever, was the F-117 Nighthawk. Flying out of King Khalid Air Base in Saudi Arabia, the F-117 looked like a faceted black wedge of alien technology. It was aerodynamically unstable, kept in the air only by a complex fly-by-wire computer system. It had no radar of its own to avoid emitting electronic signals. But its radar cross-section was the size of a steel marble. To the Iraqi Korea system, the F-117 was virtually invisible. But fighter jets do not win wars in a vacuum. The American strategy relied on a massive array of support aircraft that acted as the central nervous system of the strike package. The E-3 Sentry Airborne Warning and Control System, or AWACS, flew high above the battlefield, its massive rotating radome scanning the airspace for hundreds of miles, acting as an airborne traffic cop and battle manager. If an Iraqi MiG took off from a runway in Basra, the AWACS operators knew about it instantly and could vector an F-15 to intercept. Then there was the dark art of electronic warfare. The EF-111 Raven and the EA-6B Prowler were heavily modified jets packed with jamming pods. Their job was to blast the Iraqi radar frequencies with so much electronic noise that the screens inside the Korea operations centers would simply fill with white snow. And if the Iraqi radar operators tried to burn through the jamming by turning their radars to full power, they would be targeted by F-4G Wild Weasels. These specialized aircraft were armed with AGM-88 high-speed anti-radiation missiles, or HARMs. The HARM missile would lock onto the enemy radar emission and ride the beam straight down to the antenna, destroying it in a shower of high explosives and shrapnel. The Wild Weasel motto was, "First in, last out." They were the bait, daring the enemy to shoot at them so they could kill the shooter. Does any of this sound like a fair fight? Of course not. In modern war, if you find yourself in a fair fight, your tactics suck. The American planners had no intention of fighting a chivalrous duel in the skies over Baghdad. They intended to blind the Iraqi defenses, smash their communications, and then systematically dismantle their military machine from the top down. Consider the historical precedent of the combined bomber offensive in World War II. The mighty 8th Air Force flew massive formations of B-17 flying fortresses over Germany in broad daylight. They relied on hundreds of heavy 50-caliber machine guns for mutual defense against German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. The cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of American airmen were lost in the freezing skies over Europe because they had to fight their way to the target, drop their unguided bombs through the flak and clouds, and fight their way back. It was a brutal war of attrition. The Gulf War air campaign was the exact opposite. It was precision surgery with a sledgehammer. Instead of sending 1,000 bombers to destroy a single ball-bearing factory, the Air Force was now sending a single stealth fighter with two 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs to drop down a specific building's ventilation shaft. The logistics of organizing this initial strike, known as the Master Attack Plan, were mind-boggling. You have over 300 aircraft from different bases, different branches of the military, and different coalition nations. You have stealth bombers, conventional fighters, electronic jammers, and aerial refueling tankers. Every single aircraft has to take off at a precise second, hit their refueling tracks in the pitch-black night under strict radio silence, and converge on the Iraqi border at the exact same moment. If a jammer is 2 minutes late, the strike fighters it is supposed to protect will be exposed to surface-to-air missiles. If a tanker is in the wrong orbit, a flight of F-15s will run out of fuel and crash into the desert. The choreography required to synchronize this massive armada is arguably more complex than the Apollo moon landings. The tension on the flight lines in the hours leading up to H-hour was suffocating. Ground crews loaded thousands of pounds of ordnance, checking arming lanyards and laser seekers. Pilots sat in their cockpits, breathing pure oxygen, running through their checklists in the eerie green glow of their instrument panels. They knew the intelligence briefings. They knew the density of the Iraqi anti-aircraft artillery. Many expected casualty rates as high as 10 or 20% on the first night. They were flying into the teeth of the most heavily defended airspace in the world. And they were doing it in the dead of night. As the clock ticked past midnight on January 17, 1991, the heavy, humid air over the Persian Gulf was shattered by the roar of afterburners. The Armada was airborne. To the north, the Iraqi radar operators stared at their screens, completely unaware that a wave of invisible assassins was already slipping through their electronic net, while a massive wall of conventional fighters was forming up right behind them. The trap was set, the weapons were armed, and the sky was about to fall on Baghdad. But how exactly do you kick down the door of a heavily fortified air defense network without losing half your strike force in the first 5 minutes? That requires a level of tactical deception and raw electronic violence that the world had never seen before. The first blow of Operation Desert Storm was not struck by a fighter jet, but by a heavily armed rotary wing strike force, flying so low they were practically kicking up sand with their landing gear. Deep in the Saudi desert, 2 hours before the main strike package was scheduled to hit Baghdad, Task Force Normandy crossed the Iraqi border. This was a highly classified joint operation consisting of 4 Air Force MH-53J Pave-Low helicopters, leading 8 Army AH-64A Apaches. Their target was not a bunker or a tank column, but 2 isolated early warning radar sites in the southern Iraqi desert. These radars were the eyes of the Qari air defense network. If the main armada of non-stealthy fighters tried to cross the border while these radars were active, the element of surprise would be lost, and the Iraqi surface-to-air missile batteries would be waiting. The Pave-Lows were the pathfinders, utilizing their advanced terrain-following radar and forward-looking infrared, or FLIR, to navigate through the pitch-black night at 120 knots, barely 50 feet off the deck. Behind them, the Apaches were carrying a weapon that would become legendary in this conflict, the AGM-114 Hellfire missile. The Hellfire was originally designed to destroy Soviet tanks in the Fulda Gap, carrying a 100-pound tandem-shaped charge warhead. Tonight, it was being used for a very precise form of electronic lobotomy. At exactly 2:38 in the morning, the Apaches popped up from the desert floor. The gunners engaged their laser designators, painting the Iraqi radar dishes and generator trailers. In a matter of seconds, a swarm of Hellfire missiles, followed by a barrage of Hydra 70 rockets and 30mm high-explosive incendiary rounds, obliterated the sites. The radar operators never even knew what hit them. By destroying these specific nodes, Task Force Normandy kicked the door completely off its hinges, tearing a 20-mile-wide blind spot in the Iraqi radar coverage. The corridor was open, and the conventional strike packages began pouring through the gap. But while the conventional fighters were just crossing the border, the stealth fighters were already over the capital. The F-15C Nighthawk is a masterclass in aerodynamic compromise. To achieve its microscopic radar cross-section, the aircraft is built with flat, faceted surfaces designed to scatter radar waves away from the receiver. It is so aerodynamically unstable that it requires quadruple redundant fly-by-wire computers just to keep it from tumbling out of the sky. It carries no radar, no guns, and only 2 bombs in an internal bay. But those bombs were the GBU-27 Paveway 3, a 2,000-pound laser-guided munition built around a BLU-109 penetrator warhead. This was a bomb encased in an inch of hardened steel, designed to punch through several feet of reinforced concrete before detonating. At 2:51 in the morning, the skies over Baghdad were silent. The Qari system showed nothing but empty airspace. Then the roof of the massive AT&T telecommunications building, the central nervous system of the Iraqi military command, simply exploded inward. A Nighthawk pilot had dropped a GBU-27 straight down the elevator shaft. The feed to CNN went dead, and Saddam Hussein's ability to communicate with his field commanders was instantly severed. Within minutes, other F-117s struck the presidential palace, air defense headquarters, and electrical grids. Baghdad was suddenly plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the frantic, undirected fire of thousands of anti-aircraft guns shooting blindly into the night sky. Simultaneously, a threat from the sea arrived. The United States Navy launched over 100 Tomahawk land attack missiles, or TLAMs, from cruisers and battleships stationed in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. The Tomahawk is essentially a flying torpedo. It cruises at 550 miles per hour, hugging the terrain at an altitude of 100 feet to avoid radar detection. It navigates using a system called TERCOM, which uses a downward-facing radar to read the contour of the ground and match it to a digital map stored in its computer. Compare this to the V-1 buzz bombs the Germans unleashed on London during World War II. The V-1 was a weapon of pure terror that fell out of the sky whenever its crude pulse jet engine ran out of fuel, often missing its target by miles. The Tomahawk could fly 1,000 miles, navigate through the streets of Baghdad using an optical camera matching pre-programmed images, and fly through a specific window of a specific building. The sheer technological leap was staggering. But the Iraqi air defense network, though bleeding and confused, was still extremely dangerous. The surface-to-air missile batteries were on high alert, their operators waiting for targets to appear on their scopes. This is when the coalition unleashed a masterstroke of tactical deception. The United States Navy launched dozens of BQM-74 Chukar drones and tactical air-launched decoys, known as TALDs. These were essentially unpowered fiberglass gliders packed with radar reflectors. To an Iraqi radar operator staring at a green screen, a 70-pound TALD looked exactly like a massive B-52 Stratofortress bomber. How do you force an enemy to reveal his hidden positions when he knows you are hunting him? You give him a target he simply cannot ignore. When the Iraqi radar operators saw what they believed was a massive wave of heavy bombers heading straight for Baghdad, panic set in. They flipped every radar switch to maximum power, desperately trying to lock on to the incoming threat. The entire Kari network lit up like a Christmas tree, broadcasting the exact coordinates of every hidden SA-2, SA-3, and SA-6 battery in the country. And waiting in the darkness above, orbiting in the electronic shadows, were the Wild Weasels. The Air Force F-4G Phantom II and the Navy F/A-18 Hornet were carrying the AGM-88 high-speed anti-radiation missile, or HARM. The HARM does not use radar to find its target. It uses a passive seeker head that listens for the specific electronic frequency of an enemy radar dish. When the Iraqi radars locked on to the fiberglass drones, the Wild Weasels unleashed hell. Over 200 HARM missiles were fired in the first few hours of the war. A HARM flies at Mach 2.9, over 2,000 miles per hour. It rides the enemy radar beam straight down to the antenna. The Iraqi SAM operators faced a brutal binary choice: leave the radar on and be vaporized by a HARM, or turn the radar off and go completely blind. Most chose to turn them off, rendering their multi-million-dollar missile batteries useless. The strategic SAM threat was effectively castrated in a single night. With the ground-based radars suppressed, the Iraqi Air Force desperately scrambled its interceptors. MiG-29 Fulcrums and Mirage F-1s clawed their way into the night sky, their pilots ordered to intercept the massive coalition strike packages. But these pilots were flying into a buzzsaw. They were heavily reliant on ground control intercept instructions, but those ground controllers were either dead, disconnected, or blinded by the massive electronic jamming emitted by EF-111 Ravens. The Iraqi fighters were flying blind, radiating their own airborne radars into the void, which only served to announce their presence to the American combat air patrols. The F-15C Eagles were waiting. Captain John Kelk of the 33rd Tactical Fighter Wing was flying high above the desert when his APG-70 radar painted an Iraqi MiG-29 climbing aggressively. Kelk was flying in pitch darkness. He could not see the enemy visually. He had to trust the raw data on his displays. This was the ultimate realization of beyond visual range combat. During the Vietnam War, restrictive rules of engagement often forced American pilots to visually identify their targets before firing, dragging F-4 Phantoms into bloody turning dogfights with nimble MiG-21s. Desert Storm was different. The technology finally matched the doctrine. Kelk locked on to the MiG and fired an AIM-7M Sparrow missile. The Sparrow is a semi-active radar homing weapon, meaning Kelk had to keep the nose of his F-15 pointed at the MiG, painting it with radar energy for the missile to follow. The Sparrow streaked across the dark sky at Mach 4. Miles away, a massive fireball erupted in the darkness. It was the first air-to-air kill of the war. Minutes later, Captain Robert Greater, flying in the same formation, detected two Iraqi Mirage F-1s trying to flank the strike package. Greater executed a textbook intercept, firing two Sparrows and destroying both Mirages before the Iraqi pilots even realized they were being targeted. The Iraqi pilots fought bravely, but it was a slaughter. They were fighting a mathematical equation they could not solve, being shot down by enemies they never saw, using weapons they could not evade. The Iraqi Air Force, the sixth largest in the world, was systematically swept from the sky. But do not mistake this technological dominance for a sanitized, bloodless war. Down in the mud, the sky was a terrifying place for a strike pilot. While the radar-guided missiles were suppressed, the Iraqi gunners unleashed an apocalyptic volume of anti-aircraft artillery. Over 7,000 AAA pieces, ranging from heavy 57mm cannons to the rapid-fire ZSU-23-4 Shilkas, threw a solid wall of lead into the air. The sky over Baghdad and the southern airfields was a chaotic web of red and green tracers, interspersed with the blinding white flashes of unguided surface-to-air missiles fired blindly into the cloud cover. Strike packages of F-16 Fighting Falcons and F-15E Strike Eagles dove directly into this maelstrom. Their targets were the heavily fortified Iraqi air bases, Scud missile launchers, and Republican Guard command bunkers. To hit these targets, they had to fly low, dropping cluster munitions and massive unguided Mark 84 2,000-pound bombs. The weather, which is rarely a factor in the Middle East, suddenly deteriorated. Low cloud bases and violent thunderstorms forced the pilots to fly even lower than planned, pushing them right into the heart of the AAA envelope. What happens when you are flying at 500 miles per hour, 50 feet off the deck, in the middle of a thunderstorm, while an entire city is trying to shoot you down? You rely on training that borders on the fanatical and a healthy dose of pure luck. It only takes one lucky bullet, a golden BB, to sever a hydraulic line or shatter a canopy. The sheer sensory overload of dodging tracers, listening to the shrieking alarms of radar warning receivers, and trying to maintain formation in the dark is something only a combat pilot can truly understand. By dawn, the A-10 Thunderbolt IIs, the legendary Warthogs, joined the fray. Their primary mission was incredibly dangerous. They were sent to hunt down the mobile Scud missile launchers that Saddam Hussein was firing into Israel and Saudi Arabia in a desperate attempt to fracture the coalition. The A-10 is a flying titanium bathtub, heavily armored and built around the massive 30mm GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon. But it is slow. Cruising at barely 300 miles per hour, the Warthogs were prime targets for shoulder-fired infrared missiles and light anti-aircraft fire. Yet they prowled the wadis and highways, their pilots using binoculars and the naked eye to spot the camouflaged Scud launchers, rolling in and shredding the Iraqi vehicles with bursts of depleted uranium rounds. By the end of the first 24 hours, the Iraqi military apparatus was in a state of profound shock. The coalition had flown over 2,700 combat sorties. The Iraqi command and control network was shattered. Their strategic air defenses were largely disabled. Their elite fighter squadrons were either burning in the desert or cowering in reinforced concrete bunkers, desperately trying to survive the relentless pounding of precision-guided munitions. The Air Supremacy Blitz had achieved its primary objective. The sky belonged to the United States and its allies. But crippling the brain of the Iraqi military was only the first phase of the campaign. The true center of gravity, the muscle of Saddam's regime, was not in the sky. It was dug deep into the scorching sand of Kuwait and southern Iraq. Hundreds of thousands of Republican Guard troops, backed by thousands of entrenched T-72 tanks and heavy artillery pieces, were waiting for the ground invasion they believed they could win in a bloody war of attrition. To break the back of the Iraqi army and pave the way for the ground forces, the coalition air armada would have to shift its focus from surgical decapitation strikes to a grinding, systematic, and utterly ruthless annihilation of armored divisions in the open desert. The shift in focus from the strategic decapitation of Baghdad to the brutal, systematic dismantling of the Iraqi army in the Kuwaiti theater of operations marked a fundamental change in the character of the air war. Saddam Hussein had entrenched hundreds of thousands of troops, including his elite Republican Guard armored divisions, behind massive sand berms, minefields, and oil-filled trenches. His strategy was deeply rooted in the static, grinding attrition he had learned during the Iran-Iraq War. He believed that if he could just force the American-led coalition into a brutal ground war, the resulting body bags shipped back to Dover Air Force Base would shatter the American political will to fight. He was preparing for a repeat of the trench warfare of the First World War, completely failing to realize that the American military had absolutely no intention of fighting on his terms. The coalition's strategy was not to breach the Iraqi lines with infantry, but to vaporize them from the stratosphere. To accomplish this, the United States Air Force introduced a tactic that would forever change the nightmare scenarios of tank commanders worldwide, a process coldly referred to as tank plinking. The primary instrument of this armored annihilation was not the A-10 Warthog, but a heavy, swing-wing Cold War relic known as the General Dynamics F-111F Aardvark. The Aardvark was originally designed as a low-level nuclear bomber to penetrate Soviet airspace, but in the desert of the Middle East it found its true calling as a precision sniper. The secret to its success was a piece of technology bolted to its underbelly called the AN/AVQ-26 Pave Tac Targeting Pod. This pod contained a forward-looking infrared sensor and a laser designator. The physics of the desert provided the perfect kill zone. During the day, the brutal Middle Eastern sun baked the desert sand, and the steel hulls of the Iraqi T-72 and T-55 tanks to scorching temperatures. But when the sun went down, the desert sand lost its heat rapidly, dropping to near freezing. The massive steel blocks of the Iraqi tanks, however, retained their thermal energy for hours. To the weapons systems officer sitting in the right seat of an F-111 cruising at 15,000 feet in the pitch-black night, those dug-in tanks glowed on the infrared monitor like white-hot light bulbs resting on a cold, dark floor. The Iraqi tank crews thought they were hidden under camouflage netting and sand berms, completely unaware that their own armor was betraying their exact coordinates. Once a target was identified, the Aardvark crew would laze the tank and drop a GBU-12 Paveway 2, a 500-pound laser-guided bomb. The bomb would ride the invisible laser beam directly onto the turret of the tank, penetrating the thin top armor and detonating the ammunition carousel inside, resulting in a catastrophic turret-popping explosion. Why send a platoon of Marines to clear a heavily fortified bunker complex when you can simply drop a precision munition through the roof from 3 miles up? The F-111 crews became so proficient at this that they were destroying over 150 Iraqi armored vehicles every single night. To truly grasp the lethality of this campaign, we must look back to the Falaise Pocket in August of 1944. Following the Normandy invasion, the Allied forces managed to encircle the German 7th Army. As the Germans desperately tried to retreat through a narrow gap, Allied tactical air forces, flying Hawker Typhoons and P-47 Thunderbolts, descended upon the congested roads, strafing and bombing the trapped columns. It was a slaughter that broke the back of the German military in France. But the destruction at Falaise was achieved with unguided rockets and 50-caliber machine guns, requiring hundreds of low-level passes and resulting in heavy aircraft losses. In the Gulf War, the coalition achieved a level of destruction that made Falaise look like a minor skirmish, and they did it with absolute impunity, utilizing precision-guided physics from altitudes where the Iraqi anti-aircraft guns could not even reach them. But dropping the bomb is only the final link in the kill chain. The real magic of the Gulf War air campaign and the multi-dimensional advantage the United States possessed was the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance architecture that stripped away the fog of war. In previous conflicts, finding the enemy was half the battle. During the Vietnam War, tracking the movement of Viet Cong supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail required highly classified MACV SOG reconnaissance teams to physically sneak through the jungle, often engaging in desperate, bloody firefights just to confirm the presence of a truck convoy. In Operation Desert Storm, the United States deployed a revolutionary new platform called the E-8 Joint Surveillance Target Attack Radar System, or JSTARS. The JSTARS was a modified Boeing 707 airliner, distinguished by a massive 27-foot-long, canoe-shaped radome bolted under its forward fuselage. Inside that radome was an APY-3 phased array radar system, operating in 2 primary modes. The first was the ground-moving target indicator, which could detect, track, and classify any moving vehicle on the surface of the Earth from a standoff distance of over 150 miles. The second was a synthetic aperture radar that could take high-resolution radar photographs of stationary targets, even through dense cloud cover or massive sandstorms. Imagine being an Iraqi logistics commander. You order a convoy of 50 supply trucks to move ammunition to the front lines under the cover of a massive shamal, a blinding desert sandstorm. You assume you are invisible. But 30,000 feet above, orbiting safely in Saudi airspace, a J-Stars crew is watching your convoy as a series of bright yellow dots crawling across a digital map. The J-Stars operators simply pass the grid coordinates to a flight of orbiting F-15E Strike Eagles, who punch the numbers into their attack computers and drop their ordnance through the storm. The Iraqi forces were completely paralyzed. If they stayed still, they were plinked by F-100s and 11s. If they moved, they were tracked by J-Stars and obliterated by Strike Eagles. They were trapped in a technological panopticon from which there was no escape. However, warfare is never purely a military endeavor. It is the continuation of politics by other means, and Saddam Hussein was a master of political survival. Realizing his military was being systematically erased, he launched a desperate political counterattack designed to fracture the fragile coalition. He ordered his mobile missile units to fire al-Hussein Scud missiles, highly inaccurate modified Soviet ballistic missiles, directly into the civilian population centers of Israel. The strategic calculation was brilliantly sinister. If Israel retaliated and entered the war, the Arab nations in the coalition, such as Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Syria, would find themselves fighting alongside the Israelis against a fellow Arab nation. This would likely cause the coalition to collapse instantly. The United States had to prevent Israeli retaliation at all costs. This required a massive diversion of air assets into what became known as the Great Scud Hunt. Strike packages were pulled off their primary targets to scour the vast western deserts of Iraq, hunting for mobile missile launchers that could shoot and scoot in a matter of minutes. But air power alone was not enough to stop the political bleeding. The United States deployed the Patriot PAC-2 surface-to-air missile system to Israel and Saudi Arabia. The Patriot was originally designed to shoot down Soviet aircraft, but it had been hastily upgraded with software to intercept tactical ballistic missiles. When an Iraqi Scud re-entered the atmosphere at Mach 5, plunging toward Tel Aviv, the Patriot's massive phased array radar would track the incoming warhead, calculate an intercept trajectory, and launch a supersonic missile to destroy it in the sky. The actual kinetic success rate of the Patriot in the Gulf War is still fiercely debated by defense analysts, with some arguing it hit a fraction of the Scuds it claimed. But tactically, that did not matter. The Patriot was a strategic and political masterpiece. The televised images of American missiles streaking into the night sky to defend Israeli and Saudi cities provided the psychological reassurance necessary to keep Israel out of the war and the coalition intact. It was a prime example of how weapon systems can achieve strategic victory through political theatre, regardless of their pure mathematical efficiency. Behind this dazzling display of high-tech weaponry and political maneuvering lay the true unsung hero of the American way of war: the logistics train. Amateurs talk strategy. Professionals talk logistics. The air campaign of Operation Desert Storm required a supply chain of such staggering proportions that it fundamentally altered the global economy for a brief period. The United States military essentially crowdfunded the war, securing billions of dollars in contributions from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Japan, and Germany to underwrite the massive cost of moving an iron mountain across the globe. Consider the sheer volume of munitions. The air campaign dropped over 88,000 tons of bombs. To get those weapons from ammunition depots in the American Midwest to the flight lines in Saudi Arabia required a modern-day equivalent of the Red Ball Express. During World War II, the Red Ball Express was a massive truck convoy system that supplied the rapid Allied advance across France after the breakout from Normandy. It was a relentless, exhausting logistical bridge that kept the tanks rolling. In 1991, the Red Ball Express was airborne. A continuous stream of C-5 Galaxy and C-141 Starlifter transport planes created a metal bridge across the Atlantic, landing at staging bases in Europe and the island of Diego Garcia before pushing forward to the Middle East. And once the fighters were airborne, they relied entirely on the most critical yet vulnerable asset in the United States Air Force inventory: the aerial refueling tanker. The KC-135 Stratotanker and the KC-10 Extender were the lifeblood of the air campaign. Fighter jets, especially when carrying heavy bomb loads and external fuel tanks, have a surprisingly short combat radius. To reach targets deep inside Iraq, loiter over the battlefield, and make it back to base, they required multiple in-flight refuelings. The airspace over Saudi Arabia was organized into massive refueling tracks, where dozens of massive tankers flew in precise orbits, offloading millions of gallons of JP-8 jet fuel every single day. Do you think air supremacy is about having the fastest jet with the sharpest turn radius? No, it is about having a flying gas station waiting for you at exactly 30,000 feet, precisely when your fuel gauge hits bingo. If the Iraqi Air Force had possessed the capability to bypass the fighter screens and shoot down just a handful of American tankers, the entire air campaign would have ground to a catastrophic halt. But they could not, and the logistical juggernaut rolled on unhindered. After 38 days of relentless, around-the-clock aerial bombardment, the Iraqi army was a hollowed-out shell. Their command and control was non-existent. Their supply lines were severed. Their troops were starving, demoralized, and terrified of the sky. When the coalition ground forces finally launched their massive offensive on February 24th, known as G-Day, they executed a brilliant flanking maneuver known as the left hook. General Norman Schwarzkopf sent the heavily armored 7th Corps swinging deep through the trackless western desert, completely bypassing the heavily fortified Iraqi defensive lines in Kuwait. But the truth is, the ground war was merely a mop-up operation for the destruction already wrought by the Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps aviators. The Iraqi forces broke and ran almost immediately. What followed was a chaotic, desperate retreat back toward Basra, resulting in one of the most infamous and devastating scenes of modern warfare: the Highway of Death. Highway 80, the main road leading north out of Kuwait City, became a massive traffic jam of stolen civilian vehicles, armored personnel carriers, and T-72 tanks, all bumper to bumper, in a desperate bid to escape the advancing American armor. When the weather cleared, the coalition air forces descended upon the stalled convoy. Navy A-6 Intruders, Marine FA-18 Hornets, and Air Force A-10 Warthogs executed a textbook kill-box operation. First, they bombed the front of the convoy, disabling the lead vehicles and blocking the road. Then, they bombed the rear of the convoy, trapping the entire Iraqi force in a miles-long stretch of asphalt. For hours, strike aircraft systematically dismantled everything in between, dropping cluster bombs, laser-guided munitions, and strafing with heavy cannons. The destruction was so absolute, so visually apocalyptic, that it actually caused political anxiety in Washington, leading to a rapid cessation of hostilities. Historically, this level of aerial devastation against a retreating force mirrors the American experience at the Chosin Reservoir during the Korean War, but in reverse. At Chosin, Marine Corps Close Air Support, flying Vought F-4U Corsairs, relentlessly pounded the encircling Chinese forces, preventing the absolute annihilation of the 1st Marine Division as they fought their way to the sea. Air power was the shield that saved the infantry. But on the highway of death, air power was not the shield, it was the executioner's blade, acting entirely independent of ground maneuver forces to destroy a retreating army. The legacy of the Gulf War air supremacy blitz is profound and far-reaching. It fundamentally shifted the global paradigm of military doctrine. Prior to 1991, the dominant military philosophy, heavily influenced by the Soviet model, viewed air power as a supporting element to the main effort, which was always the massed armor and infantry on the ground. The airplane was essentially viewed as highly mobile flying artillery. Desert Storm inverted that equation. The air campaign proved that with stealth, precision-guided munitions, and overwhelming electronic warfare, air power could be the decisive, war-winning instrument, while the ground forces merely occupied the territory that the air forces had already conquered. The psychological shockwave of this campaign reverberated through the halls of power in Moscow and Beijing. They watched in absolute horror as their premier export equipment, the T-72 tanks, the MiG-29 fighters, and the integrated air defense networks were dismantled with effortless precision by the American kill web. The Gulf War demonstrated that massed formations of conscript armies and unguided artillery were obsolete in the face of the information age. It birthed the modern era of precision strike warfare, where the goal is no longer to destroy the enemy's army through bloody attrition, but to paralyze their nervous system and collapse their will to fight before the first tank even fires a shot. We study these campaigns not to glorify the destruction, but to understand the cold, unforgiving mechanics of power projection. The Gulf War taught us that technological overmatch, backed by flawless logistics and ruthless tactical execution, can rewrite the rules of human conflict in a matter of hours. The question is whether a military can maintain that edge when the enemy adapts, when the environment changes, and when the element of surprise is gone. Which factor do you believe was the absolute most critical to the rapid success of the coalition air campaign in the Gulf War? A. The technological superiority of stealth aircraft like the F-117. B. The flawless execution of global logistics and aerial refueling. C. The complete collapse of Iraqi military leadership and morale. Let me know your analysis in the comments below, and stay tuned to the War Room for our next deep dive into the mechanics of victory.